It says going live.
You're gonna give us a heads up before you do that?
I just did it, so we're live. and that's how you do an intro for your first ever live stream virtual conference thing. Hi, I am Chris. We are Binary Jazz. This is BinJazzConf. I think that if I stop sharing this window, it's going to turn off the music, which I don't really want to do right now. So yeah, this is our first ever thingy. Welcome the 5 of you who might be watching, I guess. Definitely welcome the 3 of you that are here. We have an extra special guest who we've never had on the show. We have a guest on the show.
Yeah.
It's so weird. Our longtime friend of the show, through proxy, if nothing else, Mr. Robin Hamill is here, and he's going to present on a thing.
Friend of the show or friend of the family, or is that too much like work ethic? Like we're a family here, bullshit. Are we allowed to curse because it's live?
Yes, we can.
I feel like we probably should cover some ground rules before this got started. Am I derailing things?
I mean, what is binary jazz if not a thing that gets derailed? Okay, so we're gonna do. All right, that's a thing. Now I'm gonna stop sharing. Although I do like that was our if you remember back, I don't know, many episodes, we got an email from Serpiente Negra Ensemble, and so I was using them as our soundtrack. So welcome everyone. Yeah, this is not a podcast. This is a event, I guess. Normally we get together and we talk about random shit that Allison comes up with, and then we decided that maybe we could do some sort of a virtual conference, and here we are. It was one of those things that didn't seem as bad of an idea after it escaped our mouths as it sounded in our heads, I guess. And because that's kind of the nature of how binary jazz started, I think that's fair. So here we are. I do kind of sort of have
a gift to back this idea in this case.
What's that?
I feel like binary jazz started with a lot of Twitter gifting.
Yeah. Well, but then it was
there a GIF of the source of this idea?
A GIF of the source of this idea. I don't think there's a GIF of the source of this idea.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, we do have a bit of a schedule there. If you go to our website, you can find BinJazzConf 2021. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. It's also where you find hopefully where you found this stream. If not, it's on our YouTube page. We have a YouTube page. Nobody goes to it. So I'm going to first hand it over to our guest. I put you in front. I hope you don't mind. I figured if you wanted to leave and not hang out with us, that's totally cool. I didn't want to force you to hang out with us for the full thing. So I sort of front loaded you, and then you could choose to depart if you so desire. But Robin is here. Yeah, friend of the family. Long time listener, first time caller, I guess. Yeah. And he's going to talk to me about knives, and I'm going to shut up now.
Cool. Thanks for the intro. I actually love going first. It's natural born leader, so like kick this off right away. Also, you don't have to like nervously sit and wait for your turn, which is also brilliant. So yeah, my name is Robin, and I'm going to talk a little bit about well, here, I'll share my screen. Apparently I need to allow Zoom permission to share my screen, so bear with me a second.
Yeah, Zoom likes those things.
Okay, let's try again. All right, so we can see this?
Indeed we can.
All right, so my my talk is on the beauty of Japanese knives and other tools. Are you seeing two slides right now? Are you seeing?
Yeah, we're seeing your the opposite of what you wanted, probably.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm getting spoilers for the next slide.
I mean, that's cool too.
Yeah, it lessens the anxiety about what's to come.
How about now? Is this what we want?
I do not see anything now.
Okay, this is going.
So
really
the way that I did it before is if you have two desktops and you do the full screen and you pick whatever desktop the full screen goes to. I was doing the full screen first. Yeah, there we go. You got it.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right, so I'm just going to get my cursor back.
This makes this a true non-tech tech conference.
Exactly. Yeah, having 5 minutes of figuring out how to share the screen.
This will be my boomer Zoom talk where I can't figure out the technology. Okay, so my talk is on the beauty of Japanese knives and other tools. And just to sort of front load this, I'm by no means an expert on this topic. This is sort of something I just have an interest in. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the things that I know in regards to this topic, which I believe to be factual, but there could be mistakes in here. So I would be diligent and do your own research if you're going to go off of anything I say on here. And also, I'm going to be talking about Japanese hand tools as well. And I am a super amateur woodworker as well. So I'm not going to be able to speak too in depth about woodworking in general, but I have a sort of fascination with some of the tools. So we'll first kick off talking about Japanese knife types. There are a plethora of different varieties out there. I'm not going to be going through an exhaustive list. I sort of selected a bunch that I found sort of interesting, ones that are common, and some outliers that I think are just sort of good for comparison. So the first category we're going to talk about, sort of broad category, is going to be double beveled knives. I think this is going to be most similar to what you're used to in your kitchen. Like pretty much all kitchen knives are going to be double beveled. You can kind of see it here that each side has, an edge to it. So they're both tapered in. So these are the two bevels. So this is something we're going to see pretty consistently across the next few items. So the first one we'll talk about is the paring knife. Now, this is something you are probably already aware of or have in your kitchen. The Japanese paring knife is very similar to its Western counterpart. It's a fairly small knife, 80 to 100 millimeters. And this is used primarily for fine detail work, peeling, of course, paring, and fits quite well in the hand. So if you need something that's quite nimble and quite delicate, you're probably going for something like a paring knife. So the Japanese equivalent uses a different steel, which we'll talk about, a little bit of a different handle, as you can see from the image here, but by and large has the same purpose as the Western equivalent. The second variety is the petty knife. Again, there is a Western equivalent of a petty knife. These are again used for peeling and shaping, a little bit longer blade, and ideal for slicing fruits and vegetables. You can also use these for preparing like herbs and garnishes. So anything that takes sort of fine chopping work, you might reach for something like a petty knife. And again, you'll see from the Japanese version of this that it has a little bit of a different handle. And the blade is mounted to the handle a little bit different than what you might be used to in a Western style. This is one of my favorite ones, the Nakiri. This is particularly by Takeda, and I have one of these myself. It was something I wanted to get for a long time. As a vegetarian, this is essentially a vegetable cleaver, so it's good for processing loads of vegetables really efficiently. It has a bunch of unique features to it based on its shape, which is, quite tall, has a square butted end. So you can kind of use it like a spatula. So you chop a bunch of things and then you can kind of scoop, vegetables off the cutting board into a frying pan or into a bowl. And because it is quite tall, you have a lot of room to fast chop against the knuckles, and it's quite safe because you have a lot of vertical room. You're not going to accidentally slip off or anything like this. So I'll show you the one I have in a little bit, but yeah, it's quite a beautiful knife. You can see this one has a bit of a rustic finish. You can get some that are finely polished, a little bit more presentational, but I love the rustic look of this one. This is probably going to be one of the most common of the Japanese knives, ones you'll find in more Japanese households and kitchens. This is the sentoku. Sentoku literally translates to the three virtues because it's especially great at chopping meat, fish, and vegetables. So if you were to only have one Japanese knife in your kitchen, the sentoku is sort of the go-to kitchen chef's knife. It's not especially large. It does have a fairly, it is fairly tall. So again, similar to the Nikiri, it gives you lots of room for chopping against the knuckles where you're not going to end up accidentally cutting yourself. And, can be used to scoop food because it is, again, quite tall. This sort of looks like a cross between the Santoku and the Nikiri. The bunka is, again, another home chef's knife. This is a little bit less common than the Santoku, but it is considered like a general purpose kitchen or chef's knife. Notice the distinctive angled tip on it. This allows you to do more detailed scoring work. So if you were scoring eggplants or zucchinis and you needed a finer tip for scoring, this would give you a little bit more control in that way. It's also not quite as tall as you might find in a Nikiri, but you still have a lot of room for chopping. It is quite large, so you can still scoop with it. And I learned that the tip is called a reverse tanto tip. The gyuto is also a chef's knife. This is probably a little more common in for professional kitchens or for professional chefs rather than like the home chef. The blade is a little bit longer. It's a little less tall. So you tend to can make longer cuts. This also is probably more suited for cutting meats and fish where you do need long, precise cuts without having to stroke the blade back and forth. Of course, it can also be used multi-purpose for cutting vegetables as well. The blade itself is a little bit less broad than the Santoku, so it has a little bit less friction when cutting because of the shorter height, but would be a real common, useful, all-purpose knife in the kitchen. And this is also a double bevel knife. This is getting into something a little bit less common. I was fascinated by this one because, again, it sort of has the same height as the Nikiri while having a similar shape to the Santoku. This is the Funayuki. This is a fisherman's knife and translates to going on boat because this was a knife that Japanese fishermen would commonly take with them on the boat and could be used to clean and fillet small to medium fish, like right on the boat. So sort of a rustic on-location knife. It seems like something that would be great to have in the kitchen, although as a person who doesn't eat fish or meat, I think it would probably not actually see its proper usage, but they are quite beautiful and I love the shape of them. We'll also take a look at a few single bevel knives. So you can see in this example, like one side of the blade is going to be ground flat, while the other side has like a single edge. So what this is going to do is give a little bit more precision in cutting. You tend to be able to lay closer to whatever you're cutting, whether that's to a cutting board, the skin of a vegetable, cutting closer to a bone, etc. So it tends to be a little bit more precise and a little bit more specialized. The Usuba is a really interesting example of a single beveled knife. It has some similar characteristics to the Nakiri in that it is somewhat tall. It has a bit of a flat end to it. This would be a bit more of a specialty knife. It is meant for cutting vegetables, similar to the Nakiri. The blade is super thin and super precise. So if you do need to make precise cuts, that's not going to bruise the fruit or bruise the vegetables. This would be ideal. It's also super useful for a rotary peeling technique. This would be where you cut a cucumber, for example, like very close to the skin to get a very, very thin cut. And you kind of roll it out into almost like a sashimi material, which then you can chop up, and you'd find this in like sushi rolls and whatnot. You can kind of see from this image as well that the single bevel is quite prominent since only one side is ground. The deba or kodeba, this is essentially a fish knife, and kodeba just means like the small deba. This is like a utility knife for breaking down and filleting whole fish. So it is quite a heavy and rustic knife, traditionally used to clean whole fish and breaking down poultry and meat. It has a bit more of a significant weight, so you can really drive it through like shells and bones and things of this nature, and usually a single bevel as well. So you can get really, really close to the bone. So a useful knife for cleaning meat and fish. And then I added this one as sort of an example of probably like a real pro chef's knife. This is a kiritsuke. This is a traditional multi-purpose knife made in a like a samurai sword style with the folded metal. It's very long, extraordinarily sharp single bevel, and this would be used for sort of multi-purpose, but also probably most likely to make longer, more precise cuts for fish, where you need a long blade with very little friction, so you don't get any dragging, no tearing, etc. And apparently these would be only used by like the executive chef. So this is like a real prize item, something for only like the top people in the kitchen. So I want to talk a little bit about Japanese steel and what makes Japanese knives like quite interesting and quite unique. There are certain properties of Japanese steel which make it quite good for tooling and also for knives. Because of the high ore deposits in Japan, that the steel that they're able to find has higher concentrations of carbon in the steel than we find in Western steel or German steel. So this allows for greater hardening of the steel overall, and harder steels are better for finer edges and better edge retention. The flip side of this is that they are more brittle and a little bit less forgiving. So for example, if you drive the wrong blade into hard materials like bone, you may be prone to chipping it. If you drop it on the kitchen floor, it could crack or break. So you do have to be a little bit more careful with it, but they can be made very, very sharp and will hold that sharpness very well. Now, there are essentially like three different types of steel you might find in Japanese knives. There is like the pretty common stainless steel. This is probably what you'll find mostly in like Western knives or German knives. These are super resistant to corrosion and staining. They're really easy to care for. I mean, you don't have to be too careful with them. You can leave them in the sink and they're not going to get corroded or rusted, of course. The downside to the stainless is that they do have a lower hardness. So, they're not going to take an edge quite as well, and they're not going to retain that edge, but they are a little bit more forgiving. So if you do strike a bone with it, or you do drop it on the counter, you're probably not going to chip or crack the blade. So, for an everyday all-purpose knife, that might be actually what you need. We have like a semi-stainless. This is going to incorporate a little bit more carbon in the steel. It's going to have better edge retention than the stainless steel. It's still going to resist most staining, but you're probably going to want to baby it a little bit more, keep it dry. Don't leave acidic materials on it, as it could patina the steel, which, some people honestly really like the look of a patina. It kind of gives it a bit of an aged look, but that can definitely happen if you're into more of a semi-stainless. And then third, what probably makes like the most like traditional Japanese knives are going to be carbon steel. So carbon steel has the best hardness and edge retention. It allows for easy sharpening. So if you're sharpening at home on a whetstone, you're going to be able to get an edge much easier than trying to work with like a stainless or a semi-stainless. The downside of this is that they are quite unforgiving. So you need to make sure you always keep them clean and dry. This is especially true for acidic materials like cutting tomatoes. If you leave tomato juice on the blade, it will start to rust or corrode the blade, within a matter of an hour or so. So you do have to keep mind of that. And yeah, whenever you're using it, you just want to make sure you're wiping it off. Usually water itself is not going to be a huge deal, but anything that's a little bit more acidic will patina or potentially rust the metal. So there are a few famous grades of carbon steel in Japanese knives. When looking to buy a Japanese knife, there might be certain varieties or certain steel types of carbon steel that we look for. There are the blue Aogami Super and Aogami 1 and 2. Blue refers to the paper these come wrapped in, so it usually comes wrapped in a blue paper. This has some alloy added to it, but is mostly high carbon and allows for a really, really sharp and tough working chef knife. So it's a little bit more forgiving. So for the everyday chef, someone working in the kitchen, this is going to be able to hold an edge really, really well and not be especially prone to chipping or cracking. The second one you'll find is white Shirogami 1 through 3. This is like a super, super pure steel, has a very low alloy content and is very high carbon. You'll see this mostly in very, very fine blades, ones that are brought to a very beautiful polish, more decorative blades. Anything that is going to be like very elite looking is probably going to be something in the white Shirogami steel. And then a couple of differences between the Japanese Japanese knives and Western ones are the handles, of course, which are pretty distinctive. In the top image, you'll find a variety of handles, which are sometimes 1 to 2 different types of wood. Sometimes they will use some either bone or horn as well for the more decorative parts. And these handles are essentially just like tapped and glued on to the end of the blade, which is a tapered shank. This in contrast to like a Western handle, which really looks like it's meant to hold in your hand. They're generally shaped into the blade and bolted on, so they look really, really robust. This will also impact how we end up holding the knife, which I think we talk about next. Yeah, so weight distribution and handling. The Japanese handles are quite light, and the blades are also light, but this does force most of the weight of the knife more forward on the blade. And by doing that, you're going to want to end up holding the knife closer to the blade, which I'll demonstrate in a second. And because you are sort of choked up on the blade a little bit more, it gives you a better feel of what you're cutting into. And it tends to be quite well balanced in the hand as well. Okay, so I'm just going to stop sharing here so I can show you a couple things. So this would be an example of like a Japanese petty, but in a Western style. So we have, the Western handle where the blade is actually tapered into the handle here. And we see like, of course, it is bolted in. It runs the full length of the handle here. So you get really quite good stiffness throughout the entirety of the blade. don't know how well you can see it, but it does have markings, and you see like sort of the waves of steel from the hammering here with the the sharpened edge throughout, so you kind of can see where the harder portion of the steel is actually right at the knife's edge here. This would be in contrast with the Japanese version of the peti, which has the wooden handle. It's two types of wood. The blade itself is pressed and glued into the handle itself. And because the weight is essentially right here in the middle of the blade, you end up holding it right here. So you pretty much pinch at the blade itself, and it stays really, really well balanced in your hand, and that gives you really good cutting performance and control. This has a little bit more of a rustic finish to it as well, which is really beautiful. It's another example of one of the handles I really like. This has a D-shaped handle, so if you're right-handed like me, it fits so well sort of in this crook of the fingers. When I held this in the store, I was like, I have to have this because it just felt like nothing else. And then you hold it, again, it's very well balanced, pretty much always they're right here. And so that's where you want to end up holding most of the weight. And then it really feels like it's very nimble and very quick. So this is Santoku. Again, you have this beautiful folding of the metal that you can still see in the blade itself. This is my very favorite. This is the Nikiri, and it's a bit more of a rustic blade. Each one of these, they're all handmade, so you can see some imperfections in the way they're hammered. The lengths are never the same, they could vary by a few millimeters. The height is never the same. Again, they can vary because these are all made by hand. Has the distinctive stamp marks. And being that this is a Aogami Super, it is made to be a daily workhorse chef's knife. So little details like the epoxy in the knife here so that you don't get any water and rotting of the blade. It's extraordinarily thin. Let's see if we can get it lined up here. And these are really fantastic for breaking down carrots or potatoes when you need to be able to chop things very fast. And because it is quite tall, you get that room where when you're chopping next to your fingers, you're not at risk of getting your fingers under there because you have a lot of room to go up and down. So this is just fantastic. It holds an edge very, very well. But you can see that even with a little bit of home use, the blade here is a little bit patinaed, which is fine. That just happens. The outer area of the blade is resistant to corrosion. It has sort of a semi-stainless coat to it, but the very, very fine edge of the blade right here, this is the exposed carbon steel. So that's what you really need to take care of. But it's really simple to sharpen these. You just lay the single bevel right on the stone. You don't need to get a micro bevel or anything. It's really just meant to be a super simple tool. So the next thing I was going to talk a little bit about are Japanese hand tools. So I figured this would be a good extension of talking about Japanese knives because they are going to use a lot of the similar materials. They have a sort of similar methodology to their use. We'll start with saws. So most Japanese saws will actually cut on the pull stroke opposed to a push saw. So if you're used to Western saws, you end up pushing them. This can sometimes be a problem as they can bind, or if the saw is quite thin, they can kind of flex and get stuck in the wood. With a Japanese pull saw, they are quite thin and quite flexible, but because you cut on the pull stroke, it actually puts the blade under tension and holds it really, really quite stiff and quite straight. So you can get a good cut going without ever worrying about kind of twisting it and getting it bound. So that is one property of Japanese handsaws is that they do cut on the pull stroke. They tend to also are able to make the blades quite a bit thinner because you're pulling them. They can be more flexible. So you get these nice, beautiful, like really, really thin blades. This is a bit more of a modern take on a Japanese pull saw. This is a Ryoba, and you'll see it's double-sided as well. It has a coarser tooth for rip cutting or cutting down the what do you call it? Down the grain of the wood, or a cross cutting, which is much finer. So if you're making cross cuts that need to prevent tear out, this would be perfect for cutting across the grain. A saw for a little bit more precise uses would be the Dazuki. This is even thinner, so it is extraordinarily thin. I think it's like a fraction of a millimeter. This would mean that it's very, very flexible, but to sort of counteract that, there is a hardened spine along here, which keeps the blade quite stiff. And because this has a very, very thin blade and very fine teeth, perfect for dovetail work where you need to get very, very clean, very, very precise cuts. However, this will not go very deep because of the spine. So you can only go, a couple of inches max. So again, perfect for dovetails, not so good for cutting through like very, very thick stock. And then there is a third one. I don't have an example of it, called the Kataba, which is a single-sided blade similar to the Dazuki, but without a backing spine on it. So it can go deeper, like on the Ryoba saw. We also have Japanese wood planes. These are really fascinating because this is kind of a cheaper, smaller wood plane, but compared to a Western equivalent, the body itself is all wood. They're usually handmade. You would have a handmade blade. We have what's called a chip breaker in here as well, and then like this retention pin. And the thing that's really fascinating about these is when you buy one, if you get one made new, they are mostly prepared for use, but you actually have to finish preparing them yourself when you get them. So there's a few things you need to do. The first thing is you have to relieve certain parts of the bottom. You need to make sure it's super flat first. So you would have to sand it very flat on like on a granite block or glass with sandpaper. And then you would use either a chisel or scraper to actually remove just a fraction of a millimeter of material in here and here to relieve the block, so that the blade itself, which you can probably just barely see poking out here, can engage with the wood and start cutting very, very thin shavings of the wood. Addition to this, you need to prepare the blade. You need to make sure that the blade itself is very, very flat on the one side, and then sharpen the edge. And to get these out, I think this is what actually attracted me, these things to me, is they can be very precise, but they almost seem quite, it's almost like quite rugged how you set these up. So if we were to take the chip breaker out, we can see that the blade itself, like it's just held in with tension. But to get that out, we would tap the back of the block itself, and the blade comes out. And so, of course, I got sawdust all over my desk. And you have to like grind this flat. This is kind of a cheap blade, but you would end up having to grind this down and then really sharpening this to a razor's edge where it could cut paper. And then when setting it up, you and you have to also make sure that this is super flat in here. So part of the process is, you put a little pencil mark on the blade and you drive it into the block, and it'll leave little marks here. And then anytime you have a high spot where the marks might show up, you would take a chisel and just take little bits of that off, and you keep doing this process over and over until it's more or less even. And then as far as setting it up goes, you would just place the blade back in the block, and then with just little micro taps, like so small, you just keep tapping it in and testing on the wood until you get something which is just right. So this sort of reminds me of, like, I used to be a trombone player, and this kind of reminds me of like how you fine tune something which has no definite stops. It's sort of an art to it. It's very precise. I kind of love that stuff. So yeah, you fine tune it by feel. So I think that's kind of beautiful. And then, yeah, next part we're going to talk about is chisels. So I did kind of mention chisels here. Japanese chisels are another really beautiful, interesting tool that are handmade. You can see that they're, like, you can see the maker's stamp on here. I don't know if it'll show up, but these are not especially expensive chisels. I think these are from Lee Valley, but they will have a milder steel body here, which will be easier to sharpen and tune up. And then they do have a laminated hardened carbon steel edge, which is just along the edge here. And the benefit of this is that you don't have something which is entirely tool steel, which would be really hard to sharpen up. It would take a lot of time on the stones. So all you really have to do is sharpen just the last little bit here to get a really, really sharp edge. Something else that's really unique about these as compared to Western chisels are the blade is quite short. Usually a Western chisel would have a blade which is very, very long. And these are also recessed. So you can see in here, there's a bit of a hollow grind. And the benefit of this here is that you can run this flat on a stone, and you don't have to work so much material off the blade. You just have to work it down until these edges are flat. And the middle is kind of nothing, it doesn't matter. And then significantly, you really just need to get this end to like a really high polish for something very, very sharp. So it should be flat, so you can get really, really close to whatever you're cutting. And then, you know, like a mirrored polish on the blade itself here. They typically have like a round wooden handle, and then they have these metal, I don't know what you call them, I guess, retention ring on the end. And these come similar to the wood planes, where when you get them, they're not actually complete. You have to finish them yourself. So you have to flatten the backs as best you can. You need to sharpen these to a high polish. And you also need to take these rings off and reset them. So you would pull the ring off. You would hammer the outer edge of the wood so that it compresses. Put the ring back on, and then soak the end of these in a little bit of water so they become soft, and hammer them down so that you sort of create a rounded bevel of wood over top of the metal ring, so that when you're hammering these, you don't end up hitting the ring. You only are hitting the wood, and the ring stops the wood from splintering or cracking or splitting away. So they kind of work in tandem. And of course, these come in different widths as well. So we have a whole set here. And then, yeah, finally, I guess the last thing I wanted to touch on was just sharpening. So I have forgot to pull these out, but we have like sharpening stones. So you can get sharpening stones that are like natural stones, like actual stones just pulled out of nature and made super, super flat, which are very, very good for sharpening knives and tools. They can also be extraordinarily expensive because they're rare and hard to get. You can also get like just man-made stones, which are probably honestly just almost as good, a fraction of the price, and will last a really, really long time. And yeah, you would, you know, clamp these inside of your holder. And yeah, whatever you're sharpening, you would, you know, you'd probably do this on a table so that you can be precise. But you would just end up working this with water across the stone, starting with a very, very coarse grit so that you can cut a lot of metal quickly, and then moving up incrementally from like, you know, maybe starting with the 400 for starting something that hasn't been sharpened in a while, going to a 1000 to get it much, much closer to a sharpened edge, and then finishing off on something like a 5,000, which would be for polishing. And if you're going to have like a whole bunch of blades like this, you are probably going to need some sort of a sharpening stone, because you probably don't want someone else sharpening your knives for you. Unless, of course, they know Japanese knives very well, and then of course, but I wouldn't go to the local guy with a sharpening wheel to sharpen your Japanese tools. And yeah, I suppose that about sums it up. So that's sort of my fascination with Japanese knives and tools. I think they're aesthetically beautiful, very functional, and made in a style which I really enjoy using. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Let me unpin you. So I was going to do a thing where we were just going to not do any questions at all, and then we would ask, like, the show would be the questions, and then if you weren't there, then we would just make up the answers in typical binary jazz style. But I'm really interested in I'm just gonna go back on that idea entirely because I have questions. What made you interested in Japanese knives specifically? It's like sort of a very specific sort of interest.
Yeah, so I should mention actually that all the images from the slides were from this local store in Toronto called, well, I'm not in Toronto, but where we used to live, called Tosho Knife Arts. And it is the most beautiful store for Japanese knives I've ever been in. And they really know their stuff. And I went in there one day after walking by it many times because, I've always had sort of I liked having quality kitchen tools and stuff. Went in there, and they have this amazing sales technique where they can get you to cut a carrot in store. And if you cut that carrot, you're going to be walking away with that knife. So I got suckered. I loved it.
Fair.
It was like no knife I'd ever used before. It just cut so effortlessly. And then, once you have one, it's a slippery slope. So I think the first one I ever got was, I want to say it was this guy here. And, it started off with like a Western handle because that's what I was used to. And it was just so nice to use, so nice to hold. And then after that, I started to really get into the more traditional handles because I just love the way they feel. And also they're just, I think, more beautiful. The materials are really, really amazing. And it almost becomes secondary, like it's not something you hold, not like this, but it's almost like a counterbalance that is just a beautiful addition. So yeah, aesthetically, I mean, I just love the way they look in the kitchen. And yeah, once you have one, it's all downhill from there.
yeah, I can see how that would happen. About the handles, you were talking about the differences between Western handles and Japanese handles, and how the Japanese handles are sort of like glued in, and they're not like it's not bolted in the way that our handles are. And so it made me wonder if like the handles, if there's ever any sort of risk of like the blade coming out, or if that's more of a risk, like crappy old knives that you get at the secondhand store sort of thing. Like I wouldn't expect that, but like it seems like that might be sort of a natural risk of the way that they're made, but I don't.
Yeah, so they can, I suppose, come off, and this is probably something that will happen inevitably with age as maybe the wood loses its moisture and contracts, and then the fit becomes a little bit looser. It's also possible that they get dropped or they get cracked and then they need to be replaced. But luckily, you can buy these handles aftermarket. And as far as I know, if you get the right size, they just need to be like epoxied in. You just tap them on, let them cure. Of course, you never want to put any of these knives in the dishwasher, which would probably destroy the handles. But I think that goes for any knife. But yeah, the good news is you can replace them, and it's not as big of a job as like something like this, which would have to be like a perfect fit. Mm-hmm. You would have to drill these exactly. Like, in fact, you probably couldn't buy an off-the-shelf handle for this. You'd have to have one custom made. So in that way, it's probably a lot easier to replace the handle on a traditional Japanese knife.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. And yeah, do hang out if you want to hang out.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest of the talks.
All right. Well, next in line is Allison, who I am told has a very messy desk with all of her stuff all over it because she doesn't actually have slides. So I'm going to pin your video if I can figure out how to do that. And Allison's going to talk to us about tarot.
Woo. Okay. For those following along at home, if you have a tarot deck, feel free to get it out. I'm going to be talking about the Fool's Journey. But first, I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of the tarot, even though we're not going over a large part of it. I'm just going to be covering the major arcana today. So that is 22 cards of the deck. But what about the other cards that I'm not discussing at all? In tarot, there's the major arcana. So that's the 22 cards that we'll be going over today. And then the rest of the cards, there are 4 suits. And then there are also court cards for those suits. So each suit is ace to 10. And then the court cards, which traditionally are page, knight, queen, and king, but you might see some different titles and stuff exchanged depending on the modernity of the deck. For instance, I have one deck that makes it more familial terms, and it's daughter, son, mother, father. So that's another example. But yeah, there are 4 suits in the tarot deck. There are cups, swords, wands, and pentacles. Again, in some decks, they are traded out for different things, but the core of it is cups are associated with the water element, swords are associated with air, wands are associated with fire, and pentacles are associated with earth. The one difference is that sometimes swords and wands are swapped as far as their elemental association, depending on the kind of the tradition that the deck was made out of. So like more pagan Wiccan tradition will have them swapped, but I tend to read them as swords as air and wands as fire. I have a deck that has them swapped and I still read them my way, but it just kind of makes for interesting interpretations with the illustrations. Along with these elemental associations, the thematic interests of the suit is cups, which are water, have to do with emotions. Swords have to do with thoughts in the mental realm. Wands have to do with projects, action, creativity. And pentacles, which is earth, are more material, tangible goods. So it could be wealth, it could be belongings, it could be groundedness, any of those things. We're not going to even touch the court cards today because they can be really confusing. But yeah, so the Fool's Journey is a way of looking at the major arcana, which ranges from the Fool all the way to the World, and it's 22 cards. There are different ways of looking at this, and the 3 main ways are linear, which is often called the 21 doors. There's the Hegelian dialectic, which splits it into 3 parts. And then there's one that cuts it in half, basically at the Wheel of Fortune. The issue here is that while these are all really good for learning, they all kind of assume a linear path of change and growth. And as a side note, because I started going down the rabbit hole on this, linear time basically exists due to the Industrial Revolution and the kind of mass production of wristwatches. So there's a quote that sums it up better than what I could, but it's time is distinguishable from linear time. Time is a concept having to do with change, and linear time is a concept having to do with the organization or interpretation of that change. And that was from Brent Silf, who's a psychologist. But basically, my main takeaway of this is that as a learning tool and as we go through the Fool's Journey, it's not necessarily a linear path. I tend to see it as more of a spiral of you can hop layers, you can go back. All these different archetypes are representative of basically a pathway to understanding, a path to self-actualization is kind of the end goal. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're starting off as a baby and then getting elderly and finding self-actualization. Any of these things can happen at any point. Let's see. There's also another great quote that, depending on how you look it up, it's either accredited to Ralph Waldo Emerson or Helen Keller. So, choose a lane. But the quote is, "Life is a succession of lessons which must be lived to be understood." And that's kind of what I apply to the Fool's Journey, is that, so you start off with the Fool, and I'm using the Modern Witch Tarot because I don't like the traditional Smith-Waite cards because they're old. And that's another thing, is that there are multiple systems of tarot. The most well-known, I think, is Smith-Waite, or Rider-Waite-Smith, depending on who you talk to. And then there's Thoth, and then there's also one called Marseille. And depending on your system, they have different origins. But today we're doing Smith-Waite. And I call it the Smith-Waite because the art is done by Pamela Coleman Smith. And Arthur Waite was the one who organized this. And for whatever reason, Rider-Waite-Smith, Rider is the publisher. Waite is no, I'm not having it. So anyway, Smith-Waite is what we're going with. I don't know why the publisher even matters in this sense. We never do that with anything else. So for the Fool's Journey, flip my page. Copious amounts of notes. I don't know why. So for the Fool, each major arcana card is also associated with an element and an astrological body. I'm not going to get into that because we don't have time. If it's somewhat relevant, or I find that it really fits the card's meaning, I'll mention it, but otherwise, no. So we start off with the Fool. The Fool has a little dog friend who's quite concerned about her well-being. The Fool isn't foolish. The Fool is idealistic. The Fool is about to take a leap of faith. The Fool has faith that everything's going to work out just fine. Sorry. I love that I never get phone calls and someone's like, "Now's the perfect time." So the Fool is all about individual expression. And so for the journey, the Fool is about to go visit. I'm going to take us on the 21 doors because and as we get into it, I'll kind of mention the other ones as well, because I think they're interesting for learning purposes, but I don't think it's all learning. So the Fool's going to visit various people and go through these different doors and find a different experience in each of them. So the other thing to note is that the Fool's card starts at 0. And the Fool isn't always actually labeled 0, but it is the 0 card because the next card is labeled 1. And this has to do with, I always tie it to 0 being a circle, a loop, and a kind of an infinity, because we're going to wind back here after we reach the end. You start back off with the Fool and the Fool's Journey again. The next card is Magician. And the Magician is very as above, so below, skill, mastery, transforming ideas into reality. So when the Fool meets the Magician, it sparks something as far as like capability, learning skills, knowing that everything you have is something that you have within. For instance, you can see that the Magician almost always is depicted with one of each of the suits. So Pentacles, Swords, Wands, Cups. And I think that's it for the Magician. We'll leave the Magician for now. I'm gonna have so many cards at the end of this. Next, the Fool meets the High Priestess. The High Priestess is all about intuition. So after meeting the Magician, the High Priestess basically is intuition, mystery, revelation of hidden matters. It's associated with water and the moon, as you can see. And anytime a moon is depicted, it often has to do with intuition or inner workings. Also, in this card, she's got a curtain with pomegranates because she's often connected with Persephone and Demeter and that myth. Anyway, I can go tangents on every card. But for the high priestess, when the fool meets the high priestess, they take the action that is provided to them by the magician, the ideas, the creativity, the tools, and go inward to figure out, what do I actually want to make? What do I actually want to do? Moving on to the Empress. The Empress is fruitfulness, luxury, productivity, creation, often portrayed as pregnant, not necessarily needing to be, but it can also be fertility and that sort of thing, depending on how you read. The Empress, upon meeting the Empress, the fool realizes that they have the tools to do everything. They know what they want to make after their meeting with the high priestess, and now they've culminated to kind of the combination of those two, which is the Empress and the act of creation and creativity. And from there, we go to the Emperor. The Emperor is all about structure, authority, unapologetic, logic. One of the teachers that I learned from said that basically the Emperor is like a redwood tree. The tree doesn't apologize for taking up space, and that's kind of the Emperor's mojo. Associated with fire and Mars, which kind of makes sense with the whole vibe of the Emperor. When the fool meets the Emperor, it creates structure to the project of what the fool is gearing up towards. So this act of creation, and now it's being reined in a little bit and constructed further with a stronger foundation. And that's what the Emperor brings to the table. Next is the Hierophant, which traditionally is basically the Pope card. And I didn't mention this, but sometimes the high priestess is La Papessa, which is like Lady Pope. And so, but the Hierophant is also traditionally the Pope card. It means, it's often, I interpret it a little more modern, but it's, you know, church ceremonies, traditional values. But I tend to look at it as a teacher card. So like wise teaching, guidance, that sort of thing, instead of more rigid. Maybe that's just the Catholic school fighting back. So when the fool meets the Hierophant, this is sort of the teaching card of getting advice on the construction of whatever's going on, the culmination of the project that they are bringing to the table after meeting with the Empress and the Emperor. And the next card is the Lovers. The Lovers is about devotion, harmony, self-love. When the fool meets the Lovers, it's the first time that they've met someone outside of themselves that they're interested in, hypothetically, in the fool's journey. And so there's this need to choose between what the project that they were working on up until this point and someone else. It's kind of like when I often compare it to like when a kid is at home and then they go to school for the first time and they're meeting new people, and they're basically like, oh, well, like this kid's family does it this way, but why do we do it this way? And kind of integrating different ideas, and as far as boundaries and rules and all that, and the tangle that happens, and choosing which you actually want to participate in. Not surprisingly, ruled by Gemini, because the Lovers, there's two. The Chariot. So the Chariot is, well, badass in this depiction, but Chariot's all about taking the reins, strength of purpose, clear direction. And so after meeting with the Lovers, the fool basically makes a decision to take a certain path and pursue what they're pursuing as far as self-development and self-actualization, and continuing to go down that road. Yeah, there was something else I wanted to say about Chariot. That's not coming to me, so I'll move on. Strength. Strength is courage in the face of adversity. It's true grit. Strength is just the woman who she has befriended that which scares her, which is why she's next to the lion. Oftentimes strength is flipped with a later card, justice. So depending on the tradition you follow, strength might be 11 and justice might be 8. But in this deck, strength is 8. So in this, the Fool is making the decision and is sticking with it, finding the strength to stick with the decision and continuing the journey, and finding the strength within to continue, basically. Whew. Number 9. Number 9 is the Hermit, which is one of my favorite cards. In this, traditionally depicted with a lantern to light the way towards knowledge, this Hermit's portrayed opening a laptop or shutting a laptop, depending on your vibe of what Hermit means. And Hermit is introspection, meditation, solitude, watchfulness. So when the Fool meets the Hermit, they're taking all the things they've learned and going inside and meditating and finding solitude and their own inner voice, hopefully coming out more within that experience. Hermit is ruled by the element of earth, so there's a groundedness to it as well, as far as like a respite from the outside noises and people weighing in on whatever you're discussing. Wheel of Fortune. Wheel of Fortune. Wheel of Fortune is changing luck, seizing the moment, and natural cycles. So basically, if things are going well, they might not be going well soon. And if things aren't going well, then they could start going well. And that's just kind of the Wheel of Fortune, the spiral of good luck and bad luck. And so after emerging from meeting the Hermit, there's a realization of you can't stay in that hermitude forever. You have to enact change and go forward with that. Whew, okay, we're on it. Justice. Justice is equality, fairness, and truth. And I also read this as a life is not fair card, because I think for people who are disadvantaged or disenfranchised, justice looks very different than to someone who has privileges. And so when the Fool meets justice, it's very much depending on how things have gone in the Wheel of Fortune, it might not actually be fair. It could very well be that there's a learning process to happen as far as how do I want to say this? What you view as fair might not be what other people view as fair, and who's in control of that, basically. That's how I read it. Knocking over cards. The Hanged One. The Hanged One is after the lessons of justice. The Fool meets the Hanged One, and it's all about new perspective, stasis, going with the flow, because the Hanged One is kind of stuck there. You're not going anywhere. The Hanged One, seeing things literally from a different angle and integrating the things that you learned from justice as far as fairness and how the world works. Whew. After the Hanged One, you have death. My cards are out of order. My cards are out of order. Justice, Hanged One, death. There we go. It's grabbing the wrong things. Death is about transition, endings, renewal, facing the unknown. So while death can mean death, it most often does not mean death. It means that there's going to be an upheaval, a change. The day before I was laid off at an agency that we all are familiar with, I drew the death card. So there we go. The death card after the Hanged One is basically the changing of ideas. You're sort of shedding a skin and moving on into this transition period of the things that you've sort of sat with in that Hanged One aspect. You being the Fool, you being whoever you want to be. Following that, should have chose a bigger piece of paper. Temperance. Temperance is about moderation. So basically what's happened is you were in the hanged one position. Everything changed with death. And then now you're trying to find an equilibrium and the pendulum swinging back and trying to find that balance. So this is about coping abilities. It can be about the union of opposites. It's about moderation. So just trying to find your footing after such drastic change has occurred. Okay, now the devil. The devil is material temptation. You can see that the people are basically chained together and chained to this lovely devil figure. Rigid morality, guilty pleasures, it often has to do with addiction. The devil is associated with Earth. It's also my astrological card because it's associated with Capricorn because of the horns. After temperance, the devil comes in on the fool's journey to basically rock the boat more and basically test your boundaries as far as your attachments and earthly pleasures. And then we're just in a good zone right now. Then is the Tower, which in my opinion is a worse card than death or the devil or whatever. The Tower is upheaval, trauma, sudden change, ruled by fire and Mars. Like it's just, there's a lot happening. There's people falling. It's a disaster. So basically it's taking what the fool has come up against in the devil, and it's the actual change that stems from the materialism or the whatever from the devil that applies to you. I did hear one nice thing about the Tower in that I heard someone say, sometimes you're the Tower and sometimes you're the lightning, which I really liked because I feel like sometimes you burn it down and you're just like, I'm doing this deliberately and it's going to be worth it. Okay. The star. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that's the star. So following the Tower, the star is hope, faith, rejuvenation. Associated with air and Aquarius, there's that light, the lightness to it. The star card is often always portrayed as David Bowie in modern decks for whatever reason, which I kind of love, but a lot of people are annoyed by, which I kind of also love. The star card is definitely the light at the end of the tunnel. It's a rock star card as far as like you're finding yourself. The fool's journey is now starting to be more comfortable in yourself and your expression of self after all the upheaval and change that's happening. You're finding a settling point and you're just kind of owning who you are. The moon. The moon is unconscious, illusions, intuition. I often associate it with mental health as well, as far as like things that you don't always see, things that aren't on the surface. Ruled by water and Pisces. When this is the moment of reflection after the star card that the fool journeys through and has a bit of downtime, a bit of inner reflection, a bit of like your rock star moment, and then after the show moment of like coming down from the adrenaline of the Tower and death and all these things and integrating it further into your psyche. And then what happens after the moon but the sun? The sun is joy, success, celebration. It's often portrayed as like a nude baby on a horse, but this one has like a toddler on a horse, which is better, I think. This is very much the rainbow after the storm, is the sun on the fool's journey. And then we have judgment, which is portrayed as basically like an angel judging people. But it's reflection, it's reckoning, it's awakening. So basically it's continuing the process of integration as far as all the lessons learned on the fool's journey and coming to a statement of judgment as far as like, it's connected to justice because justice is kind of like, are you aligned with are you walking the walk of how you talk, basically? And judgment is the reckoning of like other people being like, are you aligned? Did you stay aligned? Yeah. And the world. The world is the last card. Yay, we made it. We did it, everybody. The world is completion. It's harmony. It's fulfillment. It is the end of the fool's journey. And then at the very end of the fool's journey, you reach self-actualization, ideally. And then after the world, you start off with the fool again. Congratulations. Something to note is that the linear way, as I said, assumes a linear path of change and growth. I also really like the Hegelian dialectic, which separates it. If you form your cards into 3 lines, extracting the fool, you have, let's see, what is it? It's magician to chariot, strength to temperance, devil to world, I think. It's very much thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So it's the beginning of the journey, and then the middle of the journey is the pushback. And then the last is like the integration of all those tough ideas. And I kind of like that. And I have like, it's very much like ego, shattering of ego. And then all of a sudden you have all these like symbolic astrological bodies. So it's like very ascendant as far as a transformation or whatever. And I think that's it. If anyone has any questions, let me know.
I had one.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so one thing I've observed in various decks, and it was in your Modern Witches deck as well, is that there is a symmetry between the lovers and the devil in terms of the imagery. And I was wondering, I mean, I assume all the symbolism in all tarot cards ever is always intentional. Even if I, as a viewer, don't necessarily read it as intentional, like I assume that somebody, whoever drew that, intended it to be that way. So I was wondering if there is things that you could speak on in the relationship between the lovers and the devil. Is that like an Adam and Eve thing, like, you know, eating the apple off the tree sort of thing, and now, you know, we're facing temptation, or what?
Yeah, so for people who don't remember from my ever so brief excavate, there's 2 figures, and especially in this deck, they all very much look the same. And these are very traditional. Like this deck is basically the Smith Waite, but modernized. So they're not going off book too much. And I, as far as my reading is, it's very much an Adam and Eve thing. These figures are pre, let's say, and then these are after, and dealing with the wrath. And I've seen it portrayed in different ways, because oftentimes the symbolism doesn't stick with this, and so they portray the devil in different ways, as far as like a puppeteer and chains and some sort of ties and bonds that you can't break are usually involved in the devil. So it doesn't always have figures, but yeah, it also depends on how you read it, because like I read the lovers as very much a like often coming home to yourself and finding self-love and confidence within your own self. And as far as like, but that's just how I read. So it kind of depends. It also depends on the question, right? Like, because I'm not going to read it like that if the question is like, I don't know. I can't think of any example question right now.
And then the other thing, I was using my Cat Tarot because that's the only deck that I have that is like more traditional, because my other deck is an Oracle deck. So I just wanted to sort of like, let me show off my thing. Because this was really, I mean, there's a couple cards that kind of strayed off of the theme of the Smith Waite a little bit, but it was mostly like in line with that. But I found it interesting that the judgment in the Modern Witch deck, it's very much sort of the Christian angel coming down and sort of doing Judgment Day kind of thing, whereas in the Cat Tarot, probably not terribly surprising, but it is like Egyptian mythology based, and so you can see
nice.
like the feather that is weighed that would be weighed on the balance or the scale, whatever, and the hieroglyphics in the background. So I just thought that was really cool because it's sort of like a different take on the same idea, because it's not like God is judging you. It's like you are being balanced against your deeds or whatever.
Yeah, I like that imagery better. I don't, if listeners couldn't guess, I don't respond well to traditional religious imagery.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks, Allison. And that leads us to Gary. We wanted to bookend Gary because his topic is deep. I think that sweatshirt is probably intentional. And so whenever
it totally wasn't.
Whenever Gary finds the place that he is going to do his presentation, it will be Gary.
I had to move. Is my audio okay? That lighting is awful.
It corrected itself. So yeah, it's
okay. Cool. I had to move computers, so we're just going to do what we normally do and just see what happens.
Yep.
You can see my screen and not my speaker notes. Is that correct?
I cannot see anything yet because it says you've started screen sharing. But there we go. Yep, I see it now. Yep, we're good.
It says blame the space race and has a hashtag.
Yeah,
that may or may not be correct.
Very, very long thing. Yeah.
What, the hashtag's too long? What's that?
A hashtag? No, I see. Oh, I probably see your screen. Yeah, I think I see speaker notes. You might be teasing us again.
Hold on. All right. Now you're seeing the title slide. No?
No, I see your speaker notes.
There we
go. Now.
Well, yeah, but I need to be able to see this too. Stop share.
Change the desktop that you're sharing.
Well, it's only one desktop because I'm.
Oh right.
I'm mobile now, so I don't know. Let's just try this. Let's try that. Sure. Are you seeing?
Yes.
What are you seeing?
I'm seeing blame the space race.
You're not seeing my speaker notes now, right?
No, I just see blame the space race, BinJazzConf 2021.
Yeah, this is working exactly as we expected.
Yeah.
Just like I planned it. Blame the space race is the topic. Here's the official title. Blame the space race, Trumpism, school shootings, Enron, global warming, the war on terror, and systemic racism. This is a really nice, uplifting presentation. For 20 years, two Cold War adversaries. I'm going to read you the entire description, and then I'm going to couch it in some of what the slides actually ended up being. But this is what I submitted. And I usually like to present on close to what I submitted. I strayed a bit. For 20 years, two Cold War adversaries fought to have space superiority. In July of 1969, it ended when Apollo 11 delivered Neil and Buzz to the moon and successfully back to Earth. Humankind is no better. Humankind is no better. Yeah, that's a great spoken typo. Humankind is no doubt better as a result. And this talk will attempt to blame all the current bad shit, my kids are around, on one nation's attempt to no fair do-over their way into space dominance. I can't adequately cover this in the time provided, and I actually am going to skip some parts of the subtitle anyway. But I am going to tease out some of the really bad parts, and I'm also going to leave other bits for you to sort out on your own. And I'm also going to say it's not as bad as it seems. So we know that the space race was the US versus the Soviet Union trying to achieve superiority in space flight. I'm going to walk through a lot of dates in that process. And where possible, I'm going to note the delta between the dates because I think that's important. So the first thing we're going to do is how it ended. I just want to confirm everybody is seeing Buzz Aldrin stepping onto the surface of the moon. Yes. I mean, we can't tell it's Buzz. We just have to trust it is.
Yeah, we're good.
I am not so much of a space nerd that I can identify Buzz Aldrin by his rear end. So I will just trust this is the correct image. It ran from August of 1955 until July of 1975. Pictured here, though, is the end of the space race in 1969, which is 6 years before history says it actually ended, but this is when it ended. And we just believe this fact. And so this is Buzz setting foot on the moon as taken by Neil. I wrote a space joke in here, and I'm not sure why, but I'm going to do it anyway. So how does Buzz introduce himself at a party? I'm Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon. Neil before me. The the important part of the space race is that even though it's noted as August of 55 to July of 75, it actually happened between 57 and 69. So a bit smaller of a window. And so here's where it started. We had the Sputnik crisis. In October of 1957, Russia launched Sputnik. And it became a thing that really drove the US to write a very flexible rule book. And so part of the Sputnik crisis, JFK campaigned on closing this missile gap with Russia. Russia was clearly superior in missile technology. In 1958, so just a year after Sputnik, Eisenhower basically created DARPA, which is a fantastic investment of our money, I guess Velcro or whatever. And then studies from 55 to 61 showed like the Soviet Union was way ahead in scientists. And we have this phrase, this like concept of STEM now that like sort of started back then. I'm going to go through 3 quotes really quickly. I'm going to read them to you. I hate when people do that on slides, but you're a captive audience, so whatever. Eisenhower, the 3 tenets, or the 3 stark facts is the phrase that he used, is the Soviets surpassed America and the rest of the free world in scientific and technological advancements in outer space. If the Soviets maintain that superiority, they might use it as a means to undermine America's prestige and leadership. And if the Soviets became the first to achieve significant superior military capability in outer space and created an imbalance of power, they could pose a direct military threat to the US. Now, here's the thing I want to hang on to is that last part, direct military threat to the US. This is going to be important as we go forward, because we're going to talk about some stuff that's not military related, and then we're going to get back to military related, and then that's when the depressing stuff comes. Here's the scoreboard so far. So it's 1-0. That's it. I don't have notes on this slide. This is Laika. Laika was she was a street dog in Moscow, and she was trained. There's terrible information online about Laika's training, but part of it was they put her in smaller and smaller cages, and she had the right disposition in these smaller cages, and they said, well, we can launch this thing. She lived for 4 orbits. They couldn't create a temperature control quickly enough between Sputnik, right, October 57 and November 57. I mean, they knew they needed it. They weren't like just surprised in those 30 days or whatever. But I mean, just a month after Sputnik, they launched a dog into orbit. So after 4 orbits in, it got too warm and she overheated and died, is the nice way to say that story. 5 months later, Sputnik 2 naturally decayed in orbit, and Laika disintegrated on reentry along with their stuff. So the US at this point reached orbit with a satellite in January of 58. So about 2 months after Laika, we got a satellite in orbit. December of 58, on a different satellite, the US broadcast a recorded message from Eisenhower from space, which I guess is kind of cool. No points awarded for that though. January of 1959 was when the first human-made object left the orbit of Earth, and it was Luna. And it wasn't on purpose. They just missed the moon, and now it's orbiting the sun because that's just how gravity works. Space is hard. August of 59, the US launched a weather satellite and took some of the first photos of space. And then September of 59, the first human-made object to reach the moon was Luna. I actually didn't know. Yeah, it's Luna 2. And it crashed, but it reached the moon, and that was a Soviet spacecraft. And then October of 59, Luna 3 orbited and took a photo for the first time of the backside of the moon. I didn't actually research like how we got that photo back or anything like that, or maybe the photo was taken and stored on the satellite, never returned. I don't know. I need to research that. I don't know what happened to Luna 3. I feel like that's a deficit in preparation here. Sorry, y'all. So we're going to give a half a point for the, I guess, like the first photo from space, whatever, the US broadcast of Eisenhower talking. The Luna program really, though, gave Soviets another point. And the half point is being generous because I need a half a point later on, and I'll show you why. This is cool. This is Belka and Strelka. And now we're 57, right? Sputnik, now we're in August of 1960. Oh, you'd like to join me? My cat is interested in this as well. Yeah, the first animals, so Belka and Strelka, along with a gray rabbit, 42 mice, 2 rats, several plants and fungi, spent a day orbiting Earth they were the first higher living organisms to survive in outer space and return to Earth. So everything on that mission went up and came back, I guess alive. I don't know if they documented all the mice, but there's a lot going on. So that was August of 60. We're moving quicker, or we're having a larger break between the things now. So January 61, US sends up a chimpanzee and brings it back. So launching and returning living things, give the Soviets another point. I really thought I would get to this section quicker. We know that the space race was the US versus the Soviets trying to achieve superiority in space flight. And that was built on getting humans into space. Sure. This is Yuri Gagarin. One orbit around the Earth, 1 hour, 48 minutes, April of 61. I love this picture. I might print this one or order it online, have it framed and hang it on a wall. I don't know what else to say other than, like, you know, obviously there was like, the Soviet program is very different than the US program, but I mean, to be the first human flight is significant. This guy's Alan Shepard. He was, let's go back real quick, April 12th, 61, May 5th. It feels a little rushed, right? Like, oh, Gagarin orbited the Earth. And so Alan Shepard was launched 116 miles, did not orbit, 15 minutes in flight. Due to long delays, he expected about 2 hours from when he was loaded in to launch and landing. After 3 hours longer of delays, so like 5 hours on launch pad, he had to pee. And they said, well, you can't do that because the electrodes connected to you will short circuit. And that could be a problem. He said, well, turn him off. So I turned him off and he peed in the capsule. And then they turned him back on after the oxygen flowing down his suit dried the puddle enough for it to be safe to turn him back on. And then launched him 160 miles. This was technically the first piloted flight by a human. Long story to get into that. The thing is that this Mercury capsule, some foreshadowing, was on top of a Redstone rocket. And also some of the Mercury program was on top of Atlas rockets, which are, Atlas is probably still familiar as current ICBM. ULA is a current launch provider in the world, and they still use the Atlas 5, at least till 2025. So humans in space, we're gonna throw some more points up there. Soviet Union, 5 to a half point. Right, so some more humans. And we're going quicker now. So now we're up to 63 and 65. So in June of 63, Valentina dang, I practiced saying this too. Tereshkovna was both the first civilian and the first woman. 3 days in space, 43 orbits. Then we had Alexei Leonov. You can see him in the upper right-hand corner there outside of the thing, the capsule. The cool thing on Leonov was he was in this craft called the Vakshad 2. And because the two cosmonauts weren't able to get the center of gravity correct on reentry, they ended up landing about 47 miles from where they expected in a forest during a bear and wolf mating season. This was not unexpected. They knew that this margin of error could take place. So they had a pistol and ammunition. And because of where they landed, a crew couldn't get to them before nightfall. So they flew overhead with a helicopter and dropped supplies to keep themselves warm because the electric system suffered some damage in the landing and it was below freezing. And so they could run a fan, but not heat. And so they had to survive cold Russian night with mating bears and wolves. God, space flight's awesome. So civilian woman spacewalk, we're now 8 to a half a point. I don't even mean to make light of this. And I realize that this font and this picture seems to make light of it. These are the first human deaths that were like on the big stage in space flight. Apollo 1, now we're all the way up to 1967, January of 67. And so keep in mind, remember, July of 69 is when this whole thing ends, and we're already into January of 67. Apollo 1, in an effort to catch up, the US just threw gobs of money at the Apollo program. I mean, just ridiculous. And political pressure and unsafe ideas and whatnot, and all the documentaries you see, you're really kind of tiptoe around that. At the end of the day, what we learned from Apollo 1, along with the Challenger disaster, are really great examples on engineering ethics. And that's the good news to get out of them. I said I wasn't making light of it, but I needed a half point to deduct a point because here we are. So now, December of 1968, which means we're like 8 months away from this thing being over. Apollo 8. This is a famous picture called Earthrise. This is what I do have printed and framed and hung on a wall. I just can't imagine like what this must have looked like. I have spent countless nights laying in bed thinking about what it must be like to see the Earth rise over the moon and what that must feel like. That's not in my notes. I just got distracted. Apropos to nothing, December 24th, which is in the Christian organized religion, is Christmas Eve. The crew was broadcasting from space. Somewhere in there, I guess we could throw in a point or whatever because of like live broadcast from space. The US figured that out. And they read from the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. And so this launched a lawsuit from the founder of the American Atheists. And it was dismissed by some, and I put in parentheses with a question mark, probably white cowardly dudes, judges on technicalities. So it was never actually, the case was never actually heard, but I found that fascinating. So it's a first full point, I think we could say. And of course, we're back to this picture of Buzz Aldrin's butt. And the Soviet Union, after this like moon landing, humans on the moon, Soviets launched a space station in 1972. Hostile relations sort of ended in May of 72, but this is it. 1969, July 20th, 1969. So I guess that's worth like 8 points, maybe. I don't know. It's how the space race was won, was that moment. All right, so going back now, there's this dude, Werner von Braun, who was a Nazi, and he developed the A9/10 ICBM for the Germans during World War II. So we're back pre-space race, talking World War II. And it was intended to bomb New York and other American cities, US cities. It was initially intended to be guided by radio, and that was super duper challenging, it turned out. Like this was the system that needed to happen. So it was changed to be a piloted craft that they intended to launch. Somewhere along the way, like, you know, World War II ended. We'll get into that because gross. But Werner von Braun then became instrumental in the development of rocketry in the US, because ICBMs are useful for launching satellites and humans and are much less distasteful than launching bombs. So a great platform for research and drumming up national pride. So I don't want to like spoil anything here, but that's probably not a surprise to you. The thing with the first nuclear weapons is that there were no ICBMs at this point. And so the problem was you had to have bombers fly over to drop them. So on August 6th, 45, Hiroshima was bombed. And it took, because of communication at the time, it took 16 hours for Tokyo to understand and confirm what had happened. And the confirmation came when President Truman announced to the world, like, yeah, of course, we killed humans. And then the second bomb was August 9th. I can't imagine what that week must have felt like. Hellacious. So about 40% of residents in Hiroshima and a bit over 30% of Nagasaki died as a result of those two bombs. All right, let's time travel again. This is today, and this is like after some crazy 80s math, which is how Enron gets looped into this talk. But the rest of the world outside of these two nations and you know, whatever's left hanging out there, the rest of the world has about 1,300 nuclear warheads. So there were two nations really at play here. For what it's worth, we don't know this because we haven't proven it, but scientists believe it would take about 100 bombs to make it impossible for life to continue on with 100 nuclear bombs. So when you look at these numbers and you realize they're staggering, like they're phenomenally staggering. So there was this posturing thing that happened during the 80s, and this is during the height of the Cold War. The idea was this mutually assured destruction, meaning like, we know when you launch your nukes, we can launch ours before yours land, meaning that we're all going to be destroyed. But the reality is, if 100 landed, who cares? Okay, I took a long sidebar, and I apologize because I just couldn't help myself on space stuff. And also, I didn't really expect all the nuclear research to take me where it took me. So let's talk about Trumpism. I noted some key features of Trumpism. I mean, like, we're probably still too close to say, is this sufficient? And maybe I'm wrong on some of this. But I wanted to call it a couple things. So the first NASA astronauts, right, were test pilots. They were the image of masculinity, all men, all white, obviously, right? And this is what it meant to be an American astronaut and represent the US in this fight against the socialism of the United States, or of the Soviet Union. And so there was like this idea of like false statements, and we had to win the space race, so we just kept rewriting the rules until we did. So I want to leave that where it is and just let that simmer. I want to just jump through some stats here that are only related because of, I have to move this Zoom window tab thing. There it is. Only related just because of that slide back on the nuclear bombs, on the US being the only nation in the history of the world to use nuclear weaponry on humans. About 300 nations. US is 4% of the world's population. We're about 31% of the global weapons market. We supply about half of the other nations in the world weaponry. Defense spending is, believe it or not, surprisingly to me, is pretty consistent if you look at inflation year over year, and consistent in the sense that we spend about as much as the next 10 nations combined. Give or take, when you look at it, it's always a majority of those nations are allies. So it's baffling. There's 31 aircraft carriers in the world. 19 of them are owned by the US. There are somewhere in the range of 700 to 800 military bases in the world. 8 are Russian, 7 are Great Britain, 5 are French, and the rest are US military bases. The Pentagon spends more than all 50 states combined on health, education, welfare, and safety. I have like so many stats here, I'm skipping some. 40 to 50% of all privately owned weapons in the world are owned by the US. I guess the fourth line down is the one that I think is just like, it breaks my heart a little bit. 90 to 112 guns owned per 100 people. We are well ahead of the rest of the world on averages there. There's probably almost no category you can look at where related to firearms where the US isn't just like bafflingly ahead in numbers. And this is one of those slides where lower is better. So let's talk about how this relates to Enron, right? On May of '61, JFK had his big announcement where he said, we choose to go to the moon, blah, 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 before this decade is out. You've heard the thing. Probably on like an old CompuServe CD, right? Is where you had like a copy of the video clip. So, at that point, like Sputnik had happened, Laika had happened, the Luna program had happened, Belka and Strelka, Yuri Gagarin was not far off. So this is like the no fair do-over portion of space. Like this is where we were. And it was just this crazy posturing and controlling the message that led to, in July of '69, winning the space race with being the first to one key moment along the track. I called it global warming in my slides instead of climate change. I don't know what I was thinking there. I mean, God, what is there to say? Like, there's just an absolute attack on science now because science became boring along with space as the space shuttle did, like, crystal analysis stuff and super important scientifically, but also, could have used some marketing. I don't know. I skipped this slide. Here's some other data. You can read yourself. It's depressing. I wanted to talk about one guy though. His name was Ed Dwight. In 1961, Kennedy said that he needed a colored astronaut, so minorities could relate to the astronaut program. So Ed Dwight, who graduated cum laude with a BS in aeronautical engineering, earned the rank of captain in the Air Force, was shoveled into the astronaut training program. By 1966, he resigned, citing racial politics had forced him out of NASA and into the regular officer corps. So I want to circle back around to this, like what could have been, and what is trumpeted as a world-changing event, is built on lying, changing the rules mid-game, defining an enemy, and backing all of this military research that took place with this idea of noble goals. I think that some of the hero worship that comes along with it is problematic, continues to be problematic, and the patterns repeat themselves. So as we look at the space race and are excited about what's happened and the space race that's currently going on, the private space race, I think it's fair to ask some of the same questions. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for sharing, Gary. That was a meandering trip, almost its own fool's journey, to the extent that I don't have any questions.
I have a document of so many notes that I wanted to get to, and I just, it's painful research. So Chris, uplift us.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to bring it home. I can get my things together. Okay. Alrighty. We're gonna do this. Yeah, so share that window. And then I go over here and I do that. And you see binary jazz, yeah? You might also see yourselves. Okay. I don't need that window there. Cool. Probably unsurprisingly, I'm going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons and why I feel like you should care about it and probably play it as well. And I will be your dungeon master on this adventure into role playing. Next slide, please. There we go. All right. What is Dungeons and Dragons? Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy role-playing game that was created in 1974 by a guy named Gary Gygax. I'm going to skip over most of Gary Gygax because he is kind of a problematic character in his own right. His family is kind of problematic, and just generally, we can just skip that. But he did create Dungeons and Dragons. We're going to give him credit for that. We'll get into how he created it a little bit too. But originally, Dungeons and Dragons was built based on wargaming, and in wargaming, you create these huge armies that fight someone else's huge army, and you usually use miniatures to represent units and things, and it takes up a lot of space. It's a big, huge white person investment because it's a lot of money. And he wanted to sort of take that idea and bring it down to a smaller scale, instead tell a story about a team of adventurers going on quests. Originally, it was really like the term hack and slash was representative of what Dungeons and Dragons was at the time. It was like it was Dungeons and Dragons. You go into a dungeon, you fight a bunch of things, you get treasure, you take that treasure and you use it in the next dungeon, rinse, repeat. He as it expanded a little bit, became a little bit more narrative in form. It started to lean more and more on existing fantasy fiction at the time. He pulled things verbatim out of other authors' works, notably Tolkien's Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books. In the original versions of Dungeons and Dragons, there were one of the races that you could play as was a hobbit. That obviously needed to be changed, and there were entities known as Ents, which were then changed to tree Ents, and there were just things that were just lifted wholesale from other works of fiction. The Tolkien estate actually forced him to change hobbits and anything else that was representative of Tolkien's works. I think orcs stayed because orcs were considered generic enough and existed in other mythologies and fictions that those stayed in Dungeons and Dragons. But other things like the hobbits became halflings, Ents became treants, things like that. Where is my cursor? Okay, there we go. Role-playing, what is role-playing? So a role-playing game is any game wherein you play as a character in a story that is being told collectively. Dungeons and Dragons is not the only role-playing game, but it's probably the oldest and best known. I can't tell any story about sort of the history of Dungeons and Dragons without mentioning a little bit Satanic Panic. So there were a number of disappearances and suicides during the 80s. There was a lot of stuff going on in the 80s. And those things led to what is now known as Satanic Panic. Basically, there were a number of kids that had played or had friends that played Dungeons and Dragons that had disappeared or whatever because Dungeons and Dragons includes monsters such as demons and devils, and there's magic. There's paranoia about witchcraft in general. Parents freaked out, blamed Dungeons and Dragons, as well as many other things, including heavy metal, for all of the world's society's badness. And it was really led by these two people. And since their deaths, it was pretty sure it's the two people that are named in this poster, Mary Dempsey and Pat Dempsey. And since Mary Dempsey is deceased, the whole concept of Dungeons and Dragons being bad at all has disappeared with her. So it was literally a movement that was created by this person and has not survived. But during that time, it led to the game being pushed into the shadows, into basements, and it hurt the popularity of the game in the general public. I actually just read a Twitter thread by a tabletop RPG creator who built a game called Zweihander, and he was talking about a Bob's Burgers episode in which they were playing a role-playing game, and the fact that the way that it was framed in the episode was so normal. It wasn't about how people were weird. It wasn't about how like they were freaks. It was just this is a thing that was cool, and they were talking about it. And he personally, it resonated so much for him. He said he almost teared up because he could remember hiding his player's handbook and monster manual under the bed like they were porn. And so the legacy of that is still sort of stands today. Today, Dungeons and Dragons is known as the world's most popular role-playing game. It's pretty much a self-declared marketing gimmick. Whether or not it's actually true, it's definitely the most well-known. It's been featured in lots of TV shows like Big Bang Theory, Freaks and Geeks, Stranger Things, and has become a lot more commonplace. And when there was Twitch data that was leaked earlier this year, it was revealed that Critical Role, which is a very popular role-playing group, company, they stream their game. They've been streaming for, I think, 5-ish years, I guess. It was revealed that not only were they the most earning the most revenue on Twitch at all, but also that they earned over 9 million. In fact, might even be like 12 million. I don't remember the numbers, but it was in the millions of dollars just from last year alone from their Twitch stream. That doesn't include YouTube revenue. It doesn't include merch or advertising or partnerships. They just released a book a couple weeks ago. They've got officially published content. They've got a lot of stuff. So that one revenue stream earned them in the millions of dollars. So obviously Dungeons and Dragons is kind of a big deal now. And it's way super mainstream now. So how do you play? In Dungeons and Dragons, there's two main roles. There is the Dungeon Master, or the DM, and players. The Dungeon Master, or the DM, frames the story, is sort of the arbiter of the rules, and gives players scenarios to act out. The players navigate within that world the DM has created, making choices and taking actions the DM needs to respond and react to. The DM takes on the role of like the entire world that surrounds the characters, sometimes having to come up with scenarios, locations, and non-player characters or NPCs on the fly. And then the players will react to that world and often will act or describe their actions as their characters. I fire an arrow at that goblin, or I say this to the tavern keeper. Player characters have a set of stats that determine how good they are at things. Usually those are rolled at the beginning in character creation to you roll for your stats and then you apply them where you want based on the type of character you want to play. Dice are rolled in general to just add an element of chaos and chance to encounters. And then modifiers are added or subtracted from those dice rolls based on your stats. Anytime there is any sort of outcome that might be uncertain, whether it's because you're attacking a foe or because you're trying to persuade the barkeep to give you some information you need, that's when you want to bring in the dice. In D&D, the majority of your dice rolls are on a D20 or a 20-sided die. Occasionally, other dice will be brought in. A dungeon master might roll on different dice based on charts or tables that they have prepared or find in published materials, or players or the DM might use other dice to determine damage of various weapons or spells. There's hundreds of books published D&D adventures, settings, optional content, and rules, but you don't need all of them. You can play in an established setting. Dungeons and Dragons has several official ones, or you can make stuff up and play in a completely homebrew setting. The campaign that I am running currently takes place in the world of Exandria, which is the world of Critical Role that was created by Matt Mercer. And that's kind of technically both. It was a homebrew setting originally for him that now has officially published content. And the way that I run it is I like to kind of have a hodgepodge of everything. I just pull content in from all over the place and just kind of mix it all together and see what happens, because that's my jam. Stories in role-playing games are typically broken into campaigns. So a campaign tells the story of a particular group of adventurers. Within that campaign, there might be many story arcs that include multiple individual adventures. An adventure is sort of, a series of sessions that lead to some sort of accomplishing of a task or something. You could join together multiple campaigns to tell the overarching story of a world or a particular setting, if that's your thing. And shorter campaigns, anywhere from 1 to like 4 or 5 or 6 sessions, are generally called one-shots. And those usually focus on a particular adventure or objective for the team of adventurers. Ultimately, the DM is in charge of coming up with the world that the player characters interact in, but there should be some input from the players before and possibly during a campaign. One thing that's becoming more and more popular is running a session 0, which is you get together before the campaign actually starts. You talk about goals, you try to gauge people's interest in the types of the stories and things that they are interested in, and you maybe lay some ground rules, particularly around safety and content that might be triggering to some people, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that there are tools in place to sort of bail out if things get into territory that would be uncomfortable for people. D&D in particular talks about the 3 pillars of storytelling. There's exploration, which is discovering new things, exploring places, and generally learning about this world that the DM has created. There is social, which is interacting with the people and the world and their customs and events, and combat, which is fighting against literal or metaphorical monsters. Most D&D games will have some combination of those 3 pillars, and the specific ratio of each might depend on the group itself and the things that were discussed in that session 0. All right, so why does any of this matter? Side note, this is Tasha. She has spells named after her, most notably Tasha's Hideous Laughter. I love this picture and I love this character, and I'm glad that she has her own book now because powerful women in fiction and fantasy fiction is just awesome. She's my favorite thing. All right, there's a bunch of reasons why I feel like role-playing in general and possibly Dungeons and Dragons in particular is important. In most of these, Dungeons and Dragons just a placeholder. It's the common ground. Anything that I talk about here pretty much applies to other role-playing games as well. All right, role-playing is a great way to build empathy. I've witnessed firsthand in my players, which is largely my kids and their friends, working things out and learning how to deal with the world and people through role-playing. I've heard comments about and seen how much better kids are about working through interpersonal problems when they do come up. Role-playing is frequently used as a tool in therapy and team building, and Dungeons and Dragons is the same as any other kind of role-playing. And I think that part of Critical Role's success as a company, kind of circling back to that, and something that they've actually cited too, is the result of having played Dungeons and Dragons together for so long, learning what each other's strengths and weaknesses are and how to work together as a team toward a common goal. Role-playing is a great way to experiment with identity, things like gender identity and sexual orientation, cultural identity and beliefs, and all sorts of things that are different from your own in a hopefully safe environment. If you don't have a safe environment to explore those things, then find yourself another group because that group sucks. There's very little risk involved in playing a character with a different gender identity or sexual orientation than you, and doing so can, again, go back to the empathy thing, help build empathy for people in marginalized groups or just people that are whose background is different from your own. Role-playing fills a much needed avenue for escapism. Speaking personally, when COVID started, we had been running a weekly Dungeons and Dragons campaign, which we canceled until things ran their course, in quotations, which obviously that didn't work out so well. And very quickly, I realized that I needed an outlet for creativity in order to be okay in this new, terrifying world with rapidly changing news about the virus. So I started a small campaign just within the family, the four of us. And after some time, I started running an online campaign with a lot of the people that were in our in-person group. So for a while, I was running two campaigns concurrently. And I realized after doing that, how important D&D was and had become for me, and how I really looked forward to and needed those games just as a way to think about other things and tell a fantasy story for a while. Especially in these trying times, the need for escapism is huge, and Dungeons and Dragons and RPGs really fill that niche. And Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing in general give you an opportunity to hang out, either in person or virtually or in chat rooms with other people that have similar ideas and interests. As an extrovert, I suffer a lot when I'm not able to hang out with people, and this is a big part of 2020. Being able to get together now with vaccinated players in my home game has been huge. But even just running the game online provided an opportunity to do something fun with other human beings. I've also found and joined a number of Discord channels and virtually met folks who have a similar interest that way. Role-playing games provide an easy in to meet new people. In the WordPress community, we have meetups and WordCamps, but if these things didn't exist, and they haven't for the last while, I would have little exposure to other human beings in real life. On the other hand, I know that because I'm part of these communities, if I wanted to join an RPG group, I could find people in my area who are playing, what they're playing, the types of games that they're interested in doing, and it provides an easy icebreaker into interacting with and meeting other actual adult humans that I might not have otherwise. So go out and play some games. There is very little that you need to start playing role-playing games. Dungeons and Dragons is not the only thing, and it's maybe not even the best thing. There are any number of one-page RPGs made by the TTRPG community that can be played as one-shots if you want to just dip your feet in. There are starter kits available. This one that is on the screen, it's one of them. They're both free or otherwise for most popular role-playing games. And you can Google to find different games that might fit what you're trying to get out of it, whether it's a hack and slash dungeon crawl, an intense emo exploration into personal darkness, a descent into Lovecraftian madness, a super high-tech futuristic dystopia, or a monster of the week style episodic tale similar to Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Supernatural. Some examples of non-Dungeons and Dragons games that are popular are Call of Cthulhu, Apocalypse World, Monster Hearts, Honey Heist, The Quiet Year, Microscope, and Vampire the Masquerade, and other World of Darkness games. And kids can play too. There's variations of rules for younger kids that exist for many systems, or you can just throw the rules out the window and play simply by creating some sort of a framework using yes and just collaboratively telling stories together. There's a great Twitter thread or Twitter account that I will share somewhere because I can't remember off the top of my head, but the dude, it's a dad, and he mostly tweets and has an Instagram account wherein he gets ideas from his 4-year-old dungeon master. So it's like conversations with the 4-year-old dungeon master, and so he'll like post 4-year-old dungeon master DM tips or player tips or all sorts of things, and it's great. And when he talks about it, he talks about like how that sort of came to be, and really like they're it sounds like they're kind of sort of playing Dungeons and Dragons almost perpetually, and just without dice, and sometimes with dice. I mean, I think they do sit down and do it, but I think a lot of the times it's just, yes and playing in this persistent world, even when it's not like a sit down, get together time to play D&D. And I think that's awesome. The kids do this stuff all the time already, so we're just playing their games. Definitely report back when you've played, because I would love to hear about your experiences or explore role playing together. And then we've got a whole bunch of resources that I wanted to talk a little bit about. The first one on the list is the TTRPG Safety Toolkit. This is a collection of tools and ideas that you could bring into your session 0, or things that you could use throughout the game, where to either to set the ground rules again, and to have opportunities for players to kind of bail out of things or to fade to black to things. There are things like there's an N card. There's one system where it's like the N card, the O card, and the X card. O is okay, N is like this is getting iffy, and X card is like nope, we need to fade to black now. And those are things that somebody could like, if they're physical cards, you could actually like have a thing and raise it during the game, and then you would know, the DM would know, or the storyteller or whatever, the game master in that system would know that that's time to do whatever, and act accordingly. There is this really cool sort of flow chart like document called So You Want to Play Dungeons and Dragons, which it comes at it from the angle of, so you've heard about Dungeons and Dragons and you think it's really cool and you want to play. Dungeons and Dragons is probably not the game that you want to play. And so it goes through a process of figuring out the things that you're most interested in and points you to other games that might do that thing better. So it's a really cool way of learning about other systems that are out there that aren't Dungeons and Dragons. Because again, it's not necessarily the best thing. It's just the thing that everybody knows. I found this list of one-page RPGs. I was really trying to find just like a place where all the one-page RPGs existed. And so I found this like online game shop thing. Most of them you can download for free, but that was sort of just a collection of a whole bunch of them that I recognized. And so I just threw that out there. If you do a Google search for like one-page RPGs, you'll find a whole bunch of stuff. The notable ones that I know and like are Honey Heist and Crash Pandas. And if you kind of branch off from there to find things that are like that, you'll find a whole bunch of wacky stuff. There's a Dungeons and Dragons starter set, which is obviously sold by Wizards of the Coast. And there are Monster Slayers. So these are the Dungeons and Dragons rules that have been pared down and scaled for kids specifically. The one that I used and was familiar with is Heroes of Hesiod, which is now available on DM's Guild. That was the first one that they did. The current one is called Champions of the Elements, which I'm less familiar with. And but both of them, and that's the one that you can get on the actual Wizards of the Coast website now. And both of them just again, they do pare down the rules, make it a little bit easier and for kids to get into the idea of role playing. They've got really cute illustrations, and yeah, they're kind of neat. So that's all I got. And may all your rolls be 20. I'll stop sharing now, and y'all can ask me questions if you have them. Oh yeah, I need to do that first. Cool. That is our first BinJazzConf.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, I've got an answer.
When you first started playing, who was Dungeon Master for you?
Okay, so my entrance into role playing is a very meandering journey. I first learned about Dungeons and Dragons in like middle school because I was spending all of my time and money at a comic book shop that was close to where my parents' apartment was. And they had happened to have one of the original, not the first red box version, but like one of the original versions of the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So I got that. And then I also got like an advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which I didn't realize was a different thing at the time, player's handbook. And I tried to like mash the two together sort of. And then I got interested. They had a box set for Dark Sun, and that like set me off. But I didn't have anybody to play with. There was someone who also was interested in role-playing games who came into the shop that I hung out with a little bit, and he played games like BattleTech and Marvel Superheroes, and so I played those with him. And he was a few years older, and he sort of like ran those things, but they weren't like campaigns. It was just like, here's a thing. You've got your guy over here and I've got my guy over here, and we just fight. Later in high school, I started getting interested in Vampire the Masquerade. Again, like I was super interested in the lore and the books, didn't have anyone to play with. I think I went to a LARP, a vampire LARP once, and it was awful because it was totally unorganized. So again, didn't really have anything, but in high school, I did have a group of friends and we role played just generally without rules, just hung out and role played in parks and things. And that was sort of my, I would say, first foray into role playing in general. Even though we didn't have a system, we were, telling stories. We had persistent characters that changed and evolved over time. And there's a kind of a persistent story that was kind of being woven mostly by one person. We were all just kind of playing inside of his imagination, I think. It wasn't until college when I played a long-standing game, lasted for most of the time that I was there, of Mage the Ascension, that I actually would consider myself a player that actually had in a game that actually had a storyteller or a game master. So that was so that would be sort of the first dungeon master. When I came to D&D, which is, really just more recently, like I got books and I wanted to introduce the kids to it at some point when they were younger. And so I started kind of venturing into it a little bit at a time, kind of like in between like the 3.5 and 4th edition of D&D, where like things, like I had some stuff that was from conflicting editions that didn't really fit together. But I was trying to just like mash things together. But we didn't really do anything until, the last couple of years, and went primarily because the kids were trying to do D&D at like libraries and things. And those games were not particularly well run and kind of chaotic. And I wanted to they wanted to run their own games. And I was like, okay, that's great. But in order to run a game, you kind of need to know what a really good game feels like. So, and it wasn't going to happen. No one else was going to do it. So we decided to just do it. And that was when I started digging into 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons and really starting to learn about stuff and started listening to Critical Role. So like my first and probably kind of only game master was still that one game that I played in for a couple years in college. So that was Mage the Ascension. Well, we lost to Gary.
I think a dog got loose.
Yeah. So like classic binary jazz chaos, I suppose. I guess the second half of BinJazzConf, I really just kind of wanted to leave open-ended so that if there were sort of follow-on things that we wanted to talk about from anyone's topics, that we had room to do that, and that would be sort of the topic of the day. I do have we could bring in Allison's questions from several weeks ago, or like I really wanted to do a thing where we looked at the Sharper image catalog together, because I got a Sharper image catalog and I was flipping through it. I'm like, oh my God. And I started making commentary about it as I was going through, and no, I need to save this commentary for actually being recorded or something.
That's definitely, Sharper image catalogs are big.
We've gotten 3 of them. We have gotten 3 Sharper image. I don't know how. We've never purchased anything from the Sharper image, so I don't know how we are on a mailing list to have received 3 separate, distinct and unique from each other Sharper image catalogs.
Oh, I thought you meant 3 of the same. That's weirder.
They're sent at different times. And they were different. I mean, it's the same stuff for the most part, just the order is different, but they're distinctly different Sharper image catalogs.
That's so bizarre.
Okay. But yeah, I really like going along to your talk, Allison, with the cat tarot, and looking at the cards and looking at your cards, and then trying to see what the differences and similarities were.
I know, and I was trying to figure out which deck to use, and I was like, okay, I guess I'll just use the one that makes the most sense, because I was just like, I do have some like outliers, but I'm just like, but the symbolism doesn't, or at least to me, it doesn't add up as much to the original meaning. So like they're not the best beginner decks. So oh well, but yeah.
Sister-in-law's dog. I think Gary should have just kept the laptop on and just like been running after a dog like live, or like had his phone. I think he should call in. I should probably say that in the Slack channel.
First time caller, long time participant. We've got Gary on the line.
I'm the Gary now.
Yeah, yeah. Robin's the new Gary.
Yeah, Robin's the new Gary. Okay, so talk about space.
Yeah.
I'll field any questions about Gary's talk.
I was going to mention in my talk that the major arcana is also known as the trumps, but that word has been ruined for us. So I no longer use it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that word a lot more recent, in the last 6 years, I guess, than I think I ever did before, and how the like, because it's not his real name either, so like it's a choice of his to go by that, and yeah, it's yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty lucky if you can choose your own name. And we or my brother knew a guy whose last name was Champion, and we're like, that's not his real name. that's a chosen name.
Yeah.
Wow, he must have been really confident, or
what
not
would be
confident.
What would be really cool about but having that name is when you get together in family reunions, you have a theme song. Just play Queen's "We Are the Champions."
Yeah, like, play me in as I enter the room.
Just Mr. Champion. Like, I just can't. I don't know.
Bob Champion.
Bob.
Robert Champion.
Robert. Oh. Well, you know me. I'm all talked out. That was the most talking I will do all day.
Yeah. Well, we had a viewer for a while. So
yeah, I think well, shout out to Danette, who was watching in a coffee shop. She said she was going to hang on for as long as the Wi-Fi.
But yeah, thanks y'all for putting your talks together and for doing this thing, and maybe it's a thing that we'll do again. I don't know.
It's a nice way to wrap up the season.
It is kind of, yeah. I was thinking like, well, we've got kind of like one more week, but we could just like call this the sort of season finale or something.
Yeah. Then the next one will be our holiday special.
Yeah, the holidays. There you go. That's perfect.
It's just like, you don't have to pay attention, but see, you don't have to have paid attention to any of the series anyway.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Oh, well. Robin, you can drop if you have work stuff.
Yeah, I guess I should go pay attention to some of the stuff that pays the bills.
What?
But it was super fun hearing everyone's talks, and it was actually great to talk about something that wasn't work related as well. So I appreciate that, because I've given talks before, but they're always to do with like code and whatnot, and it's a great outlet to have something completely separate. Yeah,
it was sort of my goal from the beginning to make sure that this wasn't about things that we would talk about at work, and because that wouldn't be what binary jazz kind of has become, and to like have no pretensions about like having a particular audience or like speaking to anyone other than like the people that are here, because that's what binary jazz has always been, is like we entertain ourselves, and we're entertaining for ourselves, and if other people are watching or listening, then cool. But so that was the only sort of requirement, is like, is this something that you are passionate about and are interested in, and do you want to share it with other people? And I think that's
I think your talk inspired Gary and Chris to buy a Japanese knife.
Yeah, no, I definitely added, I have a Notion a wish list in Notion, and I added at the bottom of that to get a Nikiri.
It's definitely like my favorite shape. I feel like it's very utilitarian. And
Yeah, I like it. I like it both because it looks like a cleaver, and also because of what you said, that it's really good at chopping vegetables, which is like obviously as a vegan, that's what we do a lot of. So like it's terrifying and functional.
But I
yeah,
feel like,
exactly.
don't you find as a vegetarian or vegan that you don't really get to use a cleaver shape
Yeah,
thing
there's
very often?
well,
Like,
yeah, no, I wouldn't, but I don't know that I would have used a cleaver even when I mean, I haven't really prepared meat.
no, I haven't either. Someone asked me about that the other day, and I was like, I basically became a vegetarian around the time when I would have had to start preparing
Right,
food for myself. So
right, yeah, yeah,
I wouldn't have any idea how to do it for someone else.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
And there's definitely styles that I've been like aesthetically attracted to. And then once I look into them more, they don't make any sense because they'll be like, this is very specifically for cutting fish or meat. And I'm like, well,
Mm,
that's never going to happen for me. So, I mean, it would just be collecting at that point. I'm not trying to be that person.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah, but
do
it's cool 'cause
appreciate that you,
they're beautiful and functional.
yeah,
Mhm.
I do appreciate that about your collection, Ro.
I still have a couple on the wish list, but the knife board we have is only so big. So we have to be selective.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I think what was good about all of our topics is that it's not a very far departure. Like you have a collection of knives. Gary has a collection of, like, I guess, space pictures that he frames on his wall. Uh, uh, Allison has an ever-growing collection of tarot decks. I have like a shelf back there that is full of Dungeons and Dragons books. So, like, I feel like it's like these are sort of the easy things. Aaron had suggested that next year, if we do this again, that we pick topics for each other as opposed to picking to our own topics, because
Oh
Ooh.
yeah.
so it's more like coming to binary jazz and getting a topic that you have to talk about, and whether or not you know anything about it.
Would you find your topic out in advance, or would it just be
Yeah, no, it'd have to be in advance. It wouldn't be like slide roulette or whatever that's called.
okay?
Yeah, it would be like we figure out what the topics are. We do like a secret Santa
Secret Santa
for topics, and then you have time to do whatever research or not that you want to do.
I like that.
Yeah,
Well, that's kind of what I do anyway.
exactly.
The table will be turned for you, Allison, where you get something assigned to you.
I know, I'm like,
We've
it's
done
nice.
we've done that a couple times on the show, but not a ton.
Mhm.
Well, I'm
Cool.
about to drop off, y'all. I got some stuff to do, but thank you so much for the invite. It was a pleasure joining me.
Yeah, thanks for joining, and it was great meeting you.
See you in the kitchen.
See you later. Some of you sooner than later.
Yeah, I guess we can wrap there, and I will officially end the stream. Thanks anyone for watching our craziness, and I guess the video will be online, and yeah. Bye. All right, it is now